So thank you everyone for joining us for our webinar, The REIT Industry ESG Components, What to Know in 2023. Today, we will discuss new ESG regulations in connection with the real estate industry and real estate investment trusts, along with new regulations from the U.S. Department of Labor and proposed regulations from the SEC. We will also cover high-level trends and components of these new and proposed ESG regulations that businesses should be aware of in the next coming months. My name is Jacqueline Brooks, and I am chair of the firm's Real Estate Investment Trust practice. I am joined today by my partners, Sean O'Neill, who is the leader of the firm's ESG practice task force, and Michael Gohl, who is co-chair of the firm's corporate practice group. Before we begin, there are definitely a few housekeeping announcements. So we definitely want to ensure that you get out of the program all of the information that you want. And so questions can be submitted through the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. While we'll do our best to ensure that we answer questions submitted during the webinar, if we should run out of time, we will follow up individually via email. Today's program has also been approved for distance learning CLE credits in Delaware, Florida, Illinois, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. And we have a pending application in Virginia. As a CLE provider, we must be able to verify your attendance. Therefore, at random points during the webinar, we will display and verbally announce 2 numeric recording codes that you must record and report back to us using the CLE survey that you will receive in your webinar reminder email. This survey will also open automatically in your browser at the completion of the program, and we will in turn send you your certificate of attendance once we receive your survey response. Please be sure to respond to the Saul Ewing CLE survey that you'll receive with your numeric codes within 5 days of the program. Following the webinar, we will also send a follow-up email that will include links to the webinar recording and supplemental presentation materials. And then, as with many things, here's the legal disclaimer. The provision and receipt of the information in this program is not legal advice, does not create a lawyer-client relationship, and should not be acted on without seeking professional counsel who have been informed of the specific facts. And with that, I will turn it over to my partners, Sean and Michael, to begin.
Thanks, Jackie. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We're excited to talk about this today, and certainly we'd love to have any follow-up discussions. To the extent anybody has questions or want to discuss offline, we'd be happy to get into more detail on anything. But with that, let's start the show. Next slide. So, what is ESG? This term's been around for a while now, and I don't want to spend too much time on introductions because we have a lot of topics we want to cover, but I wanted to give just a quick overview at the start. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. There are a lot of different definitions out there. I got a few on the slide here of breaking down the different things that fit under this umbrella. But you know, at its core, a definition I like is that it's a measure of a company's conscientiousness, you know, social and environmental conscientiousness, where it's just a way of measuring how they are considering and trying to mitigate or enhance their impacts on the environment and the people who work for them and the people whose lives their business affects. So it's like I said, it's a very broad umbrella, covers a lot of subjects. So it's something that is relevant to every industry, but depending what industry you're in, they all have some issues that may be of greater importance or more sensitive. Next slide. So yeah, and here is just one of many examples of some of the topics that fall under these branches. But as you can see, you know, in environmental, it's a lot of that is focused on climate change and your carbon footprint. But depending on your operations, of course, if you're building or developing things, you could have direct impacts on the environment that have to be considered. Social, you know, that looks at things like employee wellness, human rights. That's big if you're looking at your supply chain. health and safety, and then governance. We're looking at things like DEI, board diversity, cybersecurity and privacy is part of that. Transparency is a big part of that. So there's different broad topics to consider any company if you're developing an ESG plan. But we're going to focus on a few regulations that impact these today, and things that people in the REIT industry should be thinking about in terms of their ESG impacts and their profile. Next slide. So why is it important? Certainly ESG has been growing in importance over the last several years. And especially under the Biden administration, there's been a lot of legislative and executive initiatives that are driving ESG awareness and issues. But it's also taken on heightened importance with investors over the last 5 to 10 years. That, we have major investment firms like BlackRock are the ones who started sort of driving this ESG movement, where they looked at these as factors that impact the value of a company and the risk of investing in them, or if they don't score high on some of these things, it makes them an investment risk, is how they view it. So it's something, especially for publicly traded companies, has to be considered because investors are looking at these things. And there's certainly risks associated with it in terms of the ever-evolving regulatory framework. There are new regulations that companies have to, and laws that companies have to try and keep abreast of and comply with. So there's some risks there in terms of making sure you're compliant and not exposing yourself to litigation or shareholder actions or anything like that. But I think it's also important to look at the opportunities that this creates, because companies that are scoring high on ESG can have a competitive advantage in the market, where there are people who will find those companies more attractive to work with, and it can offer opportunities for you. And there's also lots of statutory programs now that can give you tax savings and other incentives to embrace sustainability and green projects and reducing your carbon footprint. So there's lots of opportunities that come with this changing landscape. It's just a matter of how to navigate it. And so I'll give our first CLE code. It is 38421. Next slide. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about some of the ESG risks that we are seeing. There continues to be a rise every year in shareholder resolutions that are directed at things like climate change, sustainability, and ESG. And a lot of that is focused on one, there's certain companies, depending on your industry, that are going to see more and more of these, energy companies, companies that are viewed as overly dependent on fossil fuels have been the initial targets of a lot of these kind of shareholder resolutions. But certainly any company, if the investors feel like they are not adequately addressing things like sustainability and ESG in their reporting, we're seeing shareholder resolutions to try and force their hand. There's a rise every year in climate change litigation, and that takes any number of forms. There's lawsuits directed at investors for failure to consider some of these risks. If there's something that goes wrong with a company because of where they are adversely impacted by something relating to climate change, really, they might look at the investors and say, hey, you failed to consider these things when you were recommending investment in this company and investing our money in it. We're seeing lawsuits based on environmental rights acts. There's a number of states that have environmental rights amendments that give you a constitutional right to clean water, clean air, things like that. And so some of those are direct citizen actions. Some of those are being brought by environmental groups on behalf of the citizens of a state. But There are a number of states that are considering environmental rights amendments right now, in addition to the ones that already have them. So we expect to continue seeing those kind of actions as well. And then there's also lawsuits just for contributing to climate change harms. Now, again, a lot of those are, as one would expect, targeted at energy companies and companies that invest heavily in fossil fuels. But as the science evolves and especially if there is a specific incident, any company could find themselves drawn into an action like that. There is activist campaigns. We're seeing more and more of them asking companies to be more proactive, address fossil fuel dependence, human rights issues, anything that falls within that ESG umbrella. And then, of course, a rise every year in greenwashing claims, and we're going to touch on that in a little more detail further in the presentation. Next slide. And yeah, so as I mentioned, ESG has been one of the priorities of the Biden administration from the start. He's had a number of executive orders that address different aspects of ESG. There's been specific ones on environmental justice, social justice, but the administration has made sustainability and reducing the nation's carbon footprint a priority. So certainly any companies that are doing government contracting or securing any kind of government investments in projects, one of the factors they're going to look at is, are you carbon neutral? What are you doing to reduce your emissions? Because everything has to fit with this plan to be net zero by 2050. So the federal government is pushing that. There's lots of states that have set their own carbon reduction or carbon emission plans and targets, or other similar net zero goals by 2050 or some other year. Some states have been more aggressive than others. New Jersey has been one that's very aggressive with its clean energy agenda. So we're seeing a push though across the board from governments and agencies in how they are trying to push this agenda forward. So we see it with the SEC's proposed rules on climate change disclosures is one way that the government is advancing this goal. We have the Department of Labor just issued regulations. So across the board, we're seeing this holistic approach to advance a clean energy agenda at both the state and federal levels. So it's something that every developer needs to be considering with projects. Next slide. And I'm going to kick it over to Michael after this, but I threw this in here just as one example. There's a lot of different metrics and companies that do different ESG ratings. This is just one to show, some of the factors that are considered when they're scoring a company under their environmental score, social score, governance score. Like I said, there's a lot of variations on it. I threw this in there just to show the different areas that companies can consider if they're looking to improve their ESG rating in any given area.
And Sean, I know it's not, or it may fall under sort of the S in ESG, but we also have the FTC that have opened up a comment period in connection with non-competes and how that affects workers in various industries. And so that I think that's something that everyone will be very interested to see how that develops. But I think that's likely a part of the Biden administration also continuing to focus on these issues.
Yeah, that's a perfect example, and I'm glad you brought that one up because that wasn't on the list of regs I was going to highlight later. There's so many of them coming out right now, but yeah, that's one. Non-compete, that's one that almost straddles where it's sort of a governance issue, but certainly also a social one since it's impacting employees. but yeah, it's one of the many examples of different initiatives under the Biden administration that will, there's I feel like out of every federal department, they have some regulation or executive order that's been advanced that would fit under one of these categories. So it's certainly been a priority.
Thanks, Sean. Actually, if you can go back one slide just for a second, I was going to say one other thing on that. Yeah, I was just going to point out that, when we talk about ESG, for public companies in particular, the governance is of course important, but these issues have been kind of at the forefront and things public companies have had to confront for a long time, although the DEI initiatives, to the extent that's in governance, it kind of straddles social, is obviously taking a lot more prominence on now as well. A lot of the discussion we'll have today is about environmental. That's what's maybe at the forefront with all the discussion about climate change, and a lot of what the new SEC guidelines we'll talk about later focus on. But I just wanted to point out that all three letters are getting a lot of focus as was just referenced.
Yeah, and Michael, that you make a great point there, because at the beginning, what you said, there's a lot of these are things that companies have been doing already. They've like DEI is not a new idea or a focus for companies. There's initiatives they may already be doing. They may already be looking at ways to reduce their carbon footprint. But for some companies, looking at it under this ESG umbrella is a newer concept. And so it might be a matter of, we've been doing these initiatives under this department, these initiatives under another. And it's a way of, as at the company level, taking a more holistic approach to it. And figuring out how do we compile these efforts and frame them in the ESG context, to the extent your investors are looking for an ESG report. It's, we've already been doing great things to advance it, but, looking at it under a different light, I think is part of the struggle for some companies.
And we have two questions, I think, in connection with this particular slide and things. One of the questions is, are there tools that are out there that are used to calculate an ESG rating, or a system that allows for a standardized score?
So the answer, the short answer is yes. There's a lot of different metrics out there. But I guess the challenge is there's not necessarily like a universally accepted one. There's the international, there's more international standards that are, I think, a little more formally set, but there's any number of consulting firms out there that help you assess these scores, or within it. Like if you're looking at your carbon footprint, there are consultants that work with how to measure that, your scope 1, scope 2 emissions that we'll talk about in a little bit. There are, certainly publicly available ESG ratings that come out for investors, but the way they score things might not be the same. But yeah, there are tools out there for you to do self-assessments.
And I think you were mentioning that there are, because the other question that we had is, are the essentially the ESG ratings publicized anywhere or searchable?
Yeah, and certainly it's much easier with publicly traded companies. If you do a Google search, there's more than one service that you can pull up their company profile and they'll assign an ESG score. Some have like a number score, some just have sort of a high, low, like is it a green, yellow, red kind of situation. But there are quantitative metrics out there for different services.
Yeah, and I know as far as the REIT industry, NAREIT does issue an annual sort of ESG report, which may be helpful.
Yeah, and there's firms like BlackRock publish things too, where they'll put out like a list of the highest rated and the lowest rated ESG. I haven't looked to see if they assign a score to everybody. I think they do, but it's I haven't I haven't looked at their listing yet, their most recent one, but yeah, there's a lot out there where you can look how you've been scored.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. And now we'll talk a little bit more, try to focus in a little bit more on REITs specifically. First, just some general things that REITs have been doing, and that to the extent you're involved in the industry, you've probably seen these things, but just to kind of list some of the things that the industry has been doing. First of all, a lot of the larger REITs have been issuing standalone sustainability reports. So they're assessing their ESG themselves. There's been a big focus in REITs on data and making sure that and trying to disclose to the market what they're doing. REITs have also, a number of REITs have publicized and have made announcements about how they've been factoring diversity initiatives into their selection of suppliers and vendors. So that is getting more attention. Another area that is more attention to having ESG expertise and experience involved in putting together oversight at companies. All of these issues, environmental issues and real estate have always been tied together to a certain extent. It's always been an important factor, but focusing more on some of the sustainability issues and trying to make sure that you have executives at the company who understand those issues, and then also even going to the board level. And this is something we'll talk about later that the SEC is definitely focused on. Sorry, I thought I lost everybody on my Zoom. That everybody is definitely, the SEC is definitely focused on, as to making sure that one of the attributes that you're considering when putting people on the board is experience in ESG issues. Increasing board independence and disclosure of political spending, and aligning the political spending and lobbying efforts with ESG strategies is another thing that the REITs have been doing. And then, of course, enhanced climate change reporting. The next slide. But as mentioned, and as you all know, again, real estate and especially environmental issues have always been connected, and this has always been something that I imagine, just as good business sense, that many REITs have already focused on over the years. And so a number of things specifically that REITs have been doing recently is focusing on actually setting up emissions reductions targets, putting numbers out there and trying to meet them, and actually measuring that and publishing their success towards that. This is an issue, again, that the SEC is promoting in their regulation, and that we'll discuss. But to a certain extent, REITs have already started to take a hand in doing that. Commitments in energy efficiency, including renewable energy, adding solar to projects, decarbonization technology regularly. These are all things that REITs have been doing to try to increase their ESG scores and their commitment, and taking these considerations into building design and construction. LEED certification for in environmental scores has been around for a long time. Lots of companies and REITs have already have been considering those. Now there's also more focus on healthy buildings, as they're described, buildings that are better for their employees and are in a better better for the well-being of their employees. And there are now certifications. One is WELL, another is Fit Well, by organizations that will actually score a building, and you can get certifications as to how you're doing in those areas. But increase the commitment to biodiversity, adding more green spaces, use of water on property where appropriate and where that works. And then deploying better water conservation technology, better leak detection systems, retrofitting buildings, building fixtures so that there are more water conservation, and also water conscious landscaping. Financing through green bonds or ESG bonds, which we'll talk about on a future slide. And then also sustainable waste management practices within buildings, the idea of circular economy, that recyclables and all of that. Next slide. And so when we take this all together, these are some of the initiatives that were just mentioned are things to definitely consider. One step that pretty much all companies are doing and will need, the regulations will require them to do more, is risk assessments, as Sean mentioned before, as to climate change, setting greenhouse gas goals for reduction targets, increasing involvement in decarbonization and feasibility studies, using more green spaces, and again, to attract tenants and employees, more green certified buildings, LEED, WELL, and Fit Well. And then outside of the environmental, the improving DEI programs, identifying areas where companies may not be as successful in attracting, diversity into their workforce, setting goals, training programs, and more focus on that, is another consideration. Linking compensation to improving the talent pipeline and improving diversity goal objectives. Integrating and coordinating ESG into at the board and the management levels. And then, overall, a big issue is more disclosure and more transparency into all of this. Next slide.
Oh, and yeah, before we move on, just and this is to add to the point that Michael made earlier, is just looking at this list, there's a lot more than just the E with ESG in terms of initiatives to consider and ways to improve your ESG profile. That a lot of these things are looking beyond environmental impacts of a company. So yeah, there's really, you have to look at it at a broader level. And the other important thing to consider with any of these initiatives is how are you going to measure your progress? We'll talk about that a little further into the presentation with respect specifically to emissions. But for anything, if you're setting targets, you want to be part of the transparency is being clear on what your target is and how you're going to measure it. So that it's clear you're protecting yourself against misrepresenting anything if you're transparent about it. But investors want to know you're all right, you set this goal, but how are you going to do it and how are you going to show the progress you're making? So those are all part of the decision process when you're setting these goals.
So one question that we have in the Q&A was how important are green building certifications for REITs?
I guess I think it's all a question of your investor market, right? I mean, I think that as we're going to talk about in a second, investors are focusing on these issues more and more. And there are also a lot of investor groups out there, funds and otherwise, funds and pension funds and retirement funds and just general investment funds that have that they have pressure on themselves to make ESG friendly investments. And that does affect the market, and it does affect the market for REIT securities. And I think for REITs, it becomes, REITs are especially, green building ratings, lead certifications are a way for investing in companies that are REITs that are promoting those ideals, are a way for a lot of investors to kind of show back to their constituents that these things are important. So I do think it's become important. And it's going to be, if to the extent it wasn't, it's going to become more important.
Yeah, and I think some is location driven as well. There's certain states where it's going to be, because they've set certain goals and targets with sustainability, they're going to insist on being green certified. And another thing you can look at, there's if you're looking at a specific market, there's peer reporting, where you can look at what peer companies are doing. And if every developer in the area is getting green certifications, there's going to be a lot more pressure on you to do it, where there might be other markets where it's is not receiving the same emphasis, that you might not be something you have to do.
Right. Thank you. And I think also in connection with benchmarking, there's a question about what about the global real estate sustainability benchmark? And I think for that one, it really all depends on whether or not, sort of going back to what you and Sean and Michael were saying, it really depends on, if the institutional investors and things are part of that benchmarking organization and look to that for guidance, or look to that, then that's definitely, maybe a program that you want to look into.
Yeah, that's a great reference point. It's not exclusive, and it's not a mandatory thing, but yeah, that would be a great resource to look at.
Next slide. So now talk a little bit about ESG bonds. The term green bonds is pretty common to everybody, but it's actually a broader group of debt securities that are now being considered by companies. There are kind of the traditional green bonds, and a traditional green bond, the idea essentially is that the proceeds of the raise will be used to finance either new, or it could be an existing project or refurbishment that has positive environmental impacts. That's usually what's thought of as a green bond. Now there are also promotion of social bonds, very similar, but where in these cases it's to finance social projects or activities to achieve positive social outcomes. Maybe that's low-income housing. Maybe that's community based projects. So these have become more prominent too. Sustainability bonds are another term that's used. They can be a combination of either social or green bonds, whereas the green bonds and social bonds, again, usually as they've been promoted, are very project specific. The idea usually behind a sustainability bond is that it's focused less on a particular project and more on overall sustainability objectives. So it's a little bit more general use of proceeds. And then they've, a step further are sustainability linked bonds. These are bonds where the performance, meaning the bond coupon, is actually linked to the borrower's performing on some measure, whether it's key performance indicators or sustainability development goals, and the coupon can vary based on that. The main, there is believed to be a premium to the issuer as far as bond prices and thus lower yields in issuing ESG bonds generally. Investors seem to be willing to pay up and accept lower yields, lower on the bond to where the bonds are set up to meet these objectives. Over time, there's been an increased focus on consistency and transparency of reporting on ESG bonds. I think this is also something that you'll see more of. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the things the SEC has done on the enforcement side. And, this is an area where it would seem they would be interested. They want to make sure that when companies say that they are meeting these objectives, that they actually are. And especially, I would think on the sustainability bonds, or where, it's not a particular project, but it's, more promoting a general idea that the issue of measurability and consistency of reporting is all going to become even that much more important. Real estate examples of green bonds, are all over the place. The renewable energy, putting solar on buildings, energy efficiency, green buildings, again, healthy buildings, wastewater management projects, also putting electric vehicle charging stations into projects, updates of HVAC systems. And as was mentioned before, a key point here is that investing in ESG bonds gives institutional investors a way to meet their own ESG goals and satisfy their constituents. So it's a ripple down effect that, the more you can, these projects attract investors who are looking to use their money to meet their own objectives regarding ESG. Next slide.
Hi, this is Gary Gensler, and welcome to Office Hours. What does the SEC have to do with climate, and why is the chair of the SEC talking about climate? Well, you see, one of the most important innovations in our capital markets came along during the Great Depression, when we began requiring public disclosure of important information from companies that wanted to raise money from us. The basic bargain is this: investors get to decide what risks they wish to take. Companies, though, that are raising money from us have an obligation to share information with investors on a regular basis. Now, the first disclosures, those revolved around companies' financial performance. For example, how much revenue did the company have, or profits last year or last quarter? Then there was investor demand for information about who runs the company, who's the president, who's the chief financial officer, and the like. Later, investors wanted more information on how much a company's resources were dedicated to paying those executives. Today, investors increasingly want to understand the climate risk of the companies whose stock they own or might buy. And a lot of companies are already providing such information about climate risk. But investors representing literally tens of trillions of dollars are looking for more consistent and comparable information so they can make informed decisions about where to put their money, and that money is often the money they're investing for us. So why am I talking about climate risk? Simple, because investors are. They want to know how climate-related risk will affect the companies they own. That could mean the physical risk associated with climate change, or it might be the steps those companies are taking to lower risk associated with regulation or commitments to lower emissions. This will be good for our economy. It helps companies raise money. It will promote economic activity. And yes, it helps investors put their money in companies that fit their needs.
Next slide.
Hi.
So Chairman Gensler just, told you his view and the view of the current SEC as to the importance of these issues. And as most people know, they proposed a rule in March of last year to make various amendments to the disclosure requirements that public companies will need to comply with related to ESG and this rule principally regarding environmental issues. And that rule went into a comment period. It then had a little glitch in their comment period whereby they needed to, or did decide they needed to reopen it again. And nothing official has happened yet on this. There isn't a final rule. Originally, everybody thought there would be a final rule by the end of 2022, given how important Chairman Gensler, as well as his, at least some of his fellow commissioners at that time, felt this was, and how important it is it seems to be to the Biden administration. But the rule has not come out yet, and we don't have a good read on the timing, but we do think it's pretty soon. The rule covers a lot of the things that we've already talked about. They're going to require, if the rule in its current form, and even I imagine even after it gets through the comment process and some amendments, it's going to ask companies to disclose about climate-related risk and their exposure to climate change-related risk, likely impacts that might have on the company, on its business, on its strategy. They're going to ask for information regarding their planning related climate risk and transitions that they may need to do in their business or in how they think about it. There's a lot of focus in this release about targets and goals and making sure you're measuring it. Maybe the largest new thing in this release, at least from an SEC standpoint, is that they're actually going to require disclosure regarding greenhouse gas emissions at different and both direct, indirect, and even how it kind of affects your supply line. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little later. And this is going to kind of these changes are going to affect various different parts of disclosure documents, including certain financial metrics that are going to be implemented in this particular at least in the draft proposal. Next slide. So that, these are a little bit more specifics on some of the things that have been proposed. Talked about, I already mentioned the climate related risk and disclose how the risks are likely to have a material impact. It will require companies to indicate the processes that they have at management and the board level for assessing climate related risk. I think one thing that's probably envisioned is in that, currently all companies, when they disclose their qualifications for directors and why they've hired certain people, I think this is going to be something that's, now going to be part of that discussion. Is there someone on the board who has particular experience in these issues, in climate issues, in ESG issues, that are relevant to the particular company in the industry? The company will be, in some ways very similar to an MD&A or about, the financial issues, and a CDNA that's now in effect regarding compensation issues. There's going to need to be a discussion of identifying environmental issues, assessing and managing climate risk, and your overall risk management and how it all integrates together. How changes in the regulatory environment, changes in rules at the federal level as well as at the state and local level are on these issues are going to affect you. Now, a lot of this, the counter argument that a lot of people people in the industry might say is, we've always needed to do that to the extent that it's material. And that's true, but there's going to be more of a focus of specific areas where materiality will still be the guide, but the SEC is in effect kind of telling you they think a lot of this is material. And so that's, going to be somewhat new. I've talked about the planning and transition. So I think the next slide.
Yeah, and Michael, just to add to that, I think that's one of the big takeaways is that companies might be doing reporting on this already, and they might be tracking some of this data already. But if there's not somebody on the board or an executive position that's sort of dedicated to it, that's becoming the expectation now. You have somebody who is specifically looking at these things, taking data you might have already been gathering and reframing it to specifically address some of these concerns, just so they know the company's planning for it. The GHG disclosures, I don't want to get too granular on this since we're running short on time already, but have the GHG emissions disclosure aspect of this proposed rule has been probably the most controversial part of it. You'd have to make disclosures everybody would have to make disclosures about scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Scope 1 emissions would be the ones, greenhouse gases emitted directly from your operations. So that's, if you have a plant and smoke's coming out of it, you're tracking that, or, a boiler in your building, what's the gases being emitted from that. Scope 2 is looking at emissions you're indirectly creating from your energy consumption. So that's where you're looking at, the electricity you're using at all your facilities. Where's that coming from? What greenhouse gases are being created to supply you with that energy? And then scope 3 is the most controversial one. That's where you're looking at emissions up and down your value chain. So you'd have to look at what are the greenhouse gas emissions associated with your vendors and suppliers and the transport of materials to your facilities. So it's much more difficult, and since it's involving third parties, there's a lot more challenges as to how would you even collect that data. And the timing of the rule certainly is going to have to shift now, with it being almost a full year since it was proposed. But when it was first put out there, companies would have had 2 years essentially to be ready to report on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and for the companies that had to do scope 3, an additional year. But as you can imagine, it's not something you could just overnight say, okay, here's our numbers. You might be tracking it on a site specific level as opposed to a company wide level. You might be tracking it under a different standard than what the SEC is requiring. So you're going to have to probably collect new and additional data and compile it in a different way to comply with the SEC proposed rule. So it's going to require a lot of planning ahead, and will pose challenges for some companies. And looking ahead to that, companies should need to be thinking about how we're going to get that from our vendors and suppliers. Are you going to start putting provisions in contracts so they have to disclose that information? And when you're putting out RFPs, you got to ask about that kind of information. So you can be prepared to make those disclosures, whether because the SEC requires it or your shareholders might. Even if the SEC rule doesn't survive, you could still have a shareholder resolution that would require you to address these kind of things. Next slide. Yeah, I had a little excerpt from A Few Good Men to somebody strenuously objecting. Now, there have been strenuous objections to the SEC proposed rule. I think it set a record for comments, and some of them are still coming in. They actually reopened the comment period late last year because there was a 2-week period where it was like a computer glitch, and comments that were made might not have been received by the SEC, so they had to reopen the whole thing. As Michael said, we thought we'd get this rule by now already. I'm not sure if some delays were because of the Supreme Court's decision in the EPA versus West Virginia case that that we will talk about in a few minutes, or if because they're entertaining changes, but we haven't seen it yet, but we know as soon as it's implemented, certainly no matter what form it takes, there's going to be legal challenges to it. I have a couple slides here that provide some details on it. Again, in the interest of time, I don't want to get into too much detail, but at its core, there's going to be a statutory challenge that the SEC is exceeding its rulemaking authority. And you could see that's sort of what Chairman Gensler was alluding to in his video introducing it, or he's trying to say, well, this is our authority is for disclosures that are necessary and appropriate to ensure investor protection. And so since this is important to investors, we could have disclosures about it, but opponents of the rule will be saying this is something that steps outside what you've ever regulated. It may raise major questions doctrine, which was at issue in that EPA versus West Virginia case, where this would have broad-ranging impacts on the economy and the country if these disclosures are suddenly required. So that will be one challenge. Next slide. The other would be on a constitutional grounds, where the First Amendment, not only does it protect free speech, but it also protects against compelling speech. And so there would be a First Amendment challenge that the SEC can't force companies to make these disclosures. This slide highlights some prior examples where that's come into play, where even when the SEC had more express statutory authority with respect to the DRC conflict-free representations, it still got overturned by the courts. So, we know there's going to be these challenges coming. So there are some questions as to whether the rules would survive judicial review, or at least the entirety of it. Next slide. I mentioned the major powers or the major questions doctrine. And the idea there, it's a principle that evolved from separation of powers ideas, where you don't want to have, if you have decisions of vast economic and political significance, they can't be assigned to an agency absent clear congressional intent. So the idea is, you don't want an administrative agency creating policies that will have nationwide impacts that are on issues that should be decided by Congress, unless Congress has clearly assigned that duty to them. And in that case, they were looking at the EPA and their Clean Power Plan, which would have forced a cap and trade system to get rid of coal burning plants and shift to cleaner energy sources. And the court looked at that and said, you're taking this small catch-all provision that for decades you've never used, and now all of a sudden you're finding this is a basis for you to completely transform the energy market. But while it certainly has implications for any administrative regulations moving forward, the court was clear that it was a limited holding. Looking at the facts there, that was an example where the EPA was shifting, relying on a provision it had never relied on before for this kind of authority. And they were also enacting something that had been specifically rejected by Congress more than once. So I think the court was much more concerned there that they were stepping on the toes of Congress, where they were doing something Congress has elected not to do, using this old catch-all phrase from their enabling statute to do it. With the SEC, there's they have, I think, a different argument where they could say, yeah, this is, if it's material to investors, it's within our authority. We're not changing anything. That what we require disclosure on has always evolved. But certainly that case gives some ammunition to opponents of the proposed rule.
Yeah, I would just mention quickly that, and this same issue is going to be probably create a challenge for the new, for the FTC's recent submission that Jackie mentioned earlier regarding not competes. I mean, it's basically squarely the same issue. And I imagine all of these issues are now going to start percolating up to the court. So that next we're going to talk a little bit about, what if the SEC rules do not survive? I think our main takeaway here is we do think I think the betting money is that the rule will at least get delayed as challenges start to, as people do challenge it once it comes out. So I don't know that the actual requirements are happening tomorrow. Whether it survives or not, people probably handicap differently. But in some ways, that probably matters as to the scope, the greenhouse gas, scope 1, 2, and 3 disclosures. I mean, that, I don't know that companies are going to be forced to do that unless the SEC requires them to, unless other regulation within their industry does. But as to a lot of the rest of what's in that release, I think whether or not the rule survives, these are going to become things that are going to become important. Increasingly, we're seeing shareholder resolutions regarding these things, and the SEC is a little bit less reticent now than it was, a few years ago during the Republican administration, to disallow those shareholder resolutions. The SEC is already prioritizing ESG enforcement. They recently settled charges that there's an ESG task force that they formed in 2021 that is specifically looking at these issues within enforcement. There was a case in November of 2022 against Goldman Sachs Asset Management, whereby they basically said that an investment fund that was set up to make ESG calls was not doing that in a reasonable way. It wasn't really didn't have good measurement metrics that it was using, and it was basically they basically decided that was not the way to go about it. And so the SEC is already looking at these things, whether or not this rule changes. And then, there are various state attorney generals that are focusing on these issues, as well as consumer claims, which we imagine will increase.
And I'll note there were, I think it was last fall, it was end of last year, there was sort of published rumors that the SEC was going to drop the scope 3 emissions requirement from the proposed rule, but otherwise it would sort of remain intact. But then I saw somebody from the SEC's ESG enforcement task force. They were on a panel for something, at the very end of the year, where they were surmising that the rule is just going to be published as is, or adopted as is. So, we'll see.
And then maybe, I don't know if we're going to have time to go past this issue, but talk a little bit about greenwashing. This is the concept that you can't just, that in talking about ESG, it's not enough to just, take an initiative that you have, which sounds good in theory. It achieves, whether it's environmental objectives or other, social objectives, but not actually back up that claim. Saying you're doing it and not actually delivering the goods is likely to get you in more trouble. It's clearly, as we said, there's a task force at the SEC who's looking at this stuff. It's going to create securities fraud claims. It's going to create, the plaintiff's bar. It probably has its eye on this, and consumer protection claims could also result. It's really important to focus on disclosure and not misleading the public, and trying to use objective measures or third-party measures to back up what you're saying. Puffery, if repeated, can be actionable. And Sean, I don't know if you had more on that.
Yeah, and I have a couple things I want to add there, but in the interest of time here, just I know we're at 1 o'clock, and for people who aren't able to stay on, we have another code I think we need to give before it's over. There we go. for anybody who has to log off, thanks for joining us. We have code number 29733 is our final code for the day. But yeah, Michael, on the greenwashing, certainly as mentioned at the outset, that's one of the things we see. We're seeing an uptick in that litigation every year. A couple things to keep an eye out for, though. There's the FCC has their green guide. The last one was published in 2012. The new one is expected this year. They've put out for comment on that. But a lot of these terms we're talking about, climate change, ESG, sustainability, are terms that were not as commonplace 10 years ago. So they're expected to sort of give some guidance on what you can and can't say safely, what you need to have to back up your statements to protect yourself. So that should give some guidance to companies on greenwashing. That certainly is relevant for any kind of the consumer protection claims about how you're marketing things. But the green guide has also been referenced in these securities fraud claims as well, that it's a useful resource for the disclosures you're making. But yeah, as Michael said, you want to be there. I think there's sort of a tension where you want to be there. There's nothing sexy about saying, sustainability is like a key tenet of our company, and it drives everything we do, and we're going to be more sustainable. You want to have language that's more exciting for your investors without all the caveats, but the caveats are what can protect you from some of these incidents. And often it's sort of with greenwashing claims, it's often when it rains it pours, is that what prompts these kind of claims is usually something else has gone wrong, where there's been an incident or a permit violation, something that would be evidence that the statements you're making about safety being a priority, sustainability, or committed to reducing climate change, that if there's something you do that has adverse impacts on the community or the environment, or your employees even, that gives the ammunition to say, well, these statements were all false. So that's the unfortunate reality for companies. But yeah, we have a bunch of other slides in here just to give some more information. As I noted, there's constantly changing regulations. We've mentioned a few of them, but they're not always consistent, and they're in flux right now. But Michael, I thought maybe we could just, in the last couple minutes here, just touch on what companies could do now, to the extent any of these points we haven't hit on already.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the big takeaway here is that this is all, if it hasn't hit already, it's coming, and it's time to start, really kind of thinking about it. Again, to the extent most companies are, to some extent. But one, key takeaway is to assess your resources in being able to monitor and evaluate these types of issues and climate-related risk, and whether you have sufficient talent resources, whether you need others. Is your board set up to handle these issues? It's something to talk about with your financial teams. It's something to talk about with your auditors. It's kind of it's should be an item of review, definitely for public companies and really for other companies as well, because this is going to come to private REITs too, or other companies, especially if the Scope 3 gashouse emissions rules get put into place. You need to review internal controls, make sure these issues are being looked at correctly internally and from your internal audit function, and determine what additional controls you might need. You should be thinking about your suppliers and your vendors, your whole value chain, as to how these issues affect them. Again, even if Scope 3 greenhouse emissions doesn't come into play, you know, that is obviously affecting your own compliance and your own ability to be ESG friendly. So all of that should be looking into. And then the last thing that I would mention here is that you need to be really careful about the public statements you're making and about and it's not just as a public REIT or, you know, as a company reporting to the SEC. It's what you're doing in all your other, not just investor relations, but discussions with your customers, discussions with your suppliers. It all needs to be consistent. Especially, the ante is going to be raised for SEC compliance. And it's going to matter that that's all consistent, that you're not telling customers something differently than you're telling the markets, that you're not telling your employees something different than you're telling the markets. And, customers are the same as employees and all of that. So kind of getting a handle on that is something worth starting to do now.
And before we wrap, then we got a couple questions about double counting on the emissions. So I'll just, to the extent those people are still on the line, the way it would work. So if you're looking at your supplier and the emissions from them delivering something to you, for them, that's a scope 1 emission because that's their operations, their fleet of vehicles, the greenhouse gases they're emitting are their scope 1. For you, that's a scope 3 because it's that you're looking at your value chain. So they're being looked at differently. But again, when you look at the idea with scope 3 emissions, isn't that if you added it up for every company, yeah, there is double counting throughout because there's more than one company within the value chain. But the idea is they want to make a company look at the totality of their operations and encourage you to use the vendors and the suppliers who are more environmentally conscious, or who and a big one with that too. It's not just it's certainly relevant to your scope 3 GHG emissions, but part of ESG is also looking at with human rights and social justice kind of issues. Is everyone in your value chain getting fair wage? That's another big issue for companies. And there are consultants that out there and companies that use blockchain technology so that you can verify everyone in your value chain is getting a fair wage. So it's challenging issues that are often not that easy to track when you're looking at a company's value chain. But the idea is they just want to make companies examine that issue and try and make an impact beyond your own walls, I guess. But yeah, I know we're well past our time now. For everybody who stuck it out, thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak on this.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. So this concludes today's webinar. Remember to keep an eye out for our follow-up email, which will include links to the program materials, a recording of the webinar, as well as the CLE survey. We'll be able to enter the 2 codes that were given. Finally, if we did not get to your question, which I think we actually were able to amazingly get to all of the questions, but if there are additional questions, feel free to reach out with any questions that you may have. Our contact information is there and will be shared in connection with the materials. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.